Enjoy listening to this and other great podcasts from Jacob's Tent? Want even more content from us? Download the Jacob's Tent app today and gain access to the latest videos, teachings, and exclusive content all in one location. Stay connected and up to date with everything happening in the tent with the Jacob's Tent app, available on the App Store, Google Play, or wherever you find your apps.
Since October 7th of 2023 and the vicious attacks on defenseless Israelis, the world has changed considerably. The enemies of Israel are reeling, and public opinion in Israel seems to be changing in favor of eliminating all of our enemies. In this episode of the Weekly Scroll, we're going to look into the prophetic implications that this developing situation poses and how this might spell the end of the so-called two-state solution.
Welcome to the Weekly Scroll, sharing biblical thoughts on current events. Scroll through today's top headlines with Bill Cloud as he unravels the political and spiritual implications of the world we live in, all through the lens of Scripture. Now, be encouraged, be challenged, and be ready.
Well, welcome again to the Weekly Scroll. With all the news that's been breaking in the United States, sometimes it's easy to forget that there are very important things taking shape in other parts of the world. Actually, in spite of the fact that Trump and Doge and Taylor Swift tend to dominate the headlines, the epicenter of news, as far as believers are concerned, is on the other side of the world, specifically in a little nation called Israel. And on that note, I wanted to discuss some of the latest news items that are coming from that part of the world, and we're going to start with this. Just this week, a senior Hamas official admitted to the New York Times that if he had known the destruction that would befall Gaza as a result of the attacks on October 7th, he would have never agreed to it. The head of Hamas's Foreign Relations Office in Qatar, Musa Abu Marzouk, and I'm sure I just butchered the man's name. Anyway, he said that if it was expected that what happened would happen, there wouldn't have been October 7th. Of course, he's referring to Hamas's mass infiltration of southern Israel that resulted in the murder of over 1,200 people and the kidnapping of over 250 more. Since then, of course, Israel and Hamas have been at war. Abu Marzouk admitted that even though Hamas's ability to survive to this point is, quote, a kind of victory, it was unacceptable, he said, to say that Hamas had won, especially considering the scale of what Israel inflicted on Gaza. In other words, in spite of the bravado and the boastful words, the higher echelon within the terror group are admitting that their plans may have backfired. Their jubilation on October 7th was short-lived. Now their dominance is reduced to humiliating, weakened, half-starved hostages before they turn them over to Israel. And not only are they admitting that they've been bested by the IDF, though it obviously pains them to do that, it would appear that Hamas's leadership is willing to negotiate about the group's future in Gaza. Abu Marzouk said, "We are ready to speak about every issue. Any issue that is put on the table, we need to speak about it." Now, currently, this doesn't mean that they're admitting complete defeat, nor are they willing to surrender. In fact, Hamas maintains that for all the hostages to be released, more Palestinian prisoners will have to be released from Israeli jails, and the IDF will have to withdraw from Gaza. Now, when it comes to bringing an end to the war and securing the release of the remaining hostages, reports are that Israel and the United States are working very hard on extending the ongoing first phase of the ceasefire deal. The purpose would be to free as many hostages as possible before a potential second phase begins. White House envoy Steve Witkoff confirmed that the United States wants an extension, and it appears that Israel does as well. Israeli officials told the Jerusalem Post that they expect that Hamas will also agree to such an extension. The extension of Phase 1 would allegedly result in the release of 4 male hostages as well as other wounded hostages. According to the Post, Hamas wants the deal to continue. It's in their best interest. They want more convoys and heavy equipment to enter Gaza, and they don't want to be the side at this point that causes the deal to collapse. Now, regarding phase 2 of the deal, it includes a commitment to end the war and, from Hamas's point of view, the withdrawal of all Israeli troops from Gaza, which theoretically leaves Hamas to be and continue to be the strongest force in the Gaza Strip. And this fact is why Israel is making efforts to continue with phase 1. In other words, stretching it out as far as they can until hopefully all of the hostages are released. Because, as one senior official within Netanyahu's inner circles said, quote, "The chance of continuing with phase 2 with the prices Hamas demands is zero." Netanyahu has repeatedly said that he will not allow Hamas any role in governing Gaza after this war has concluded. Now, at this point, I'd like to interject this thought. When it comes to war, total victory means destroying what your enemy believes and trusts in. For instance, before total victory was declared at the end of World War II, Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany had to be destroyed completely. And that meant not only were the munitions factories and implements of war targeted for destruction, but the ideals that led to the rise of Nazism, the fantasy that Hirohito was some kind of protective god, that had to be destroyed as well. Philosophies and ideologies had to be decimated, along with the resisting armies, before anything of any value could be rebuilt. Now, Solomon said, "To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time of war and then a time of peace." And so I want you to notice that breaking down precedes building up. A time of war precedes a time of peace. And a similar thought, the tares have to be uprooted and burned before the wheat can be gathered into the barn. So the belief that Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran are powerful entities that must be tolerated as a consequence of life has to be destroyed if Israel is to truly thrive. And it seems to me that many Israelis who were willing to accept this for decades or might be changing their mind since October 7th happened. As a result of October 7th and Israel's response to the attack, it seems to me that this notion that living side by side with terror is our only option, it would seem to me that notion is being destroyed, one terror group at a time. And I believe that this has left the enemies of Israel reeling. Now, sadly, as is often the case, for God's people to move and to decide to act decisively often requires an undesirable provocation. In other words, as tragic and as monstrous as the October 7th attacks were, Israel's reaction to those attacks is what has brought us to this point. And in my view, where we're at right now has set the stage for many other prophetic developments. Now, this isn't the first time in history that this kind of situation has taken place. As much as some may not appreciate what I'm about to say, there is reason to question whether or not there would be a state of Israel at all if there had not been a Holocaust. Likewise, would Israel's enemies be reeling and on their back foot had there not been an October 7th? Were it not for these events and the inflated egos among Israel's neighbors, would Hamas and Hezbollah be teetering on the brink of annihilation? It is written in the scripture that the enemy has fallen into the ditch which he made. His trouble shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down on his own crown. My point is, the tide is turning. And the tide is turning in part because of the actions that Hamas and Hezbollah and others have taken. Right now, Hamas is gutted. Hezbollah is retreating. And the regime in Iran is having to watch their steps very carefully. And so you might say that the game board has been completely rearranged and the players in the game are different. By that I mean, imagine what it would be like if Biden or Harris were still in power. Would Netanyahu have the confidence that he has right now that the United States would have his back if he decided to take even bolder moves? And on that note, I want you to consider this. In recent days, Hamas conducted these despicable ceremonies when they released some of the living hostages and when they released the bodies of others. And so then, in response to that, Israel postponed the release of about 600 Palestinian prisoners. Netanyahu said that he would not free Palestinian prisoners, quote, until the release of the next hostages has been assured and without the humiliating ceremonies. Now, not surprisingly, that prompted the blowhards in Hamas to threaten a halt to the talks with Israel. But in response to that, the United States expressed support for Israel's decision, which, in my opinion, is huge. Because in times past, under Biden, under others, when Israel would take such a move, they would be strong-armed by the United States to concede more, even when their enemies continued to break promise after promise. Now, I thought this was very interesting. One high-ranking U.S. military official is quoted as saying, "I wouldn't fault the Israelis either way if they just cut it here and went back on the military foot, because giving up 600 more terrorists comes with a peril of its own." Also consider this. President Donald Trump has said he will reimpose maximum sanctions on Iran, a nation who has multiple times threatened to wipe Israel off the map. But Iran, more and more, is saying these things with a lot less leverage that they previously had. And they used to be able to issue these threats, but right now they can't do much of anything. Their stature is being diminished very quickly. And if Trump actually does impose these sanctions and bankrupts Iran, as he has sworn to do, Iran and their proxies are going to kind of be in a bad situation. Their proxies are going to be left to fend for themselves. And then there's this. It's becoming increasingly evident that the Iranian people are fed up with the regime and are beginning to sense the weaknesses within that regime. In other words, the Ayatollah has to be concerned about a lot today. And it's not just the Israeli threat, but it's also the unrest that is continuing to grow in the streets of Tehran. And so once again, it seems to me that the tide is turning against the enemies of Israel. Now, that thought brings me to this. For the first time in over 2 decades, the Israeli military deployed tanks to the so-called West Bank. And so while the ceasefire in Gaza continues, Israel has steadily escalated military operations in areas designated as quote-unquote Palestinian. Reports are that known terror cells are being destroyed and people with ties to terrorists are being removed. For instance, Israel launched a military operation in January that was focused on Jenin in order to root out Iranian-backed militants. Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, said that Israel is applying its Gaza playbook to the West Bank and, quote, to prepare for an extended presence in the cleared camps for the next year and not to allow the return of residents and the resurgence of terror. Now, I find this to be extremely interesting, and especially considering that in the aftermath of the Gazan war, President Trump has proposed to relocate almost 2 million Gazans so that the Strip can be rebuilt and stripped of Hamas's influence. And on this note, it's impossible to ignore the role Trump has played in this developing situation. His election has emboldened many in Israel who want the government to extend full Israeli sovereignty into Judea and Samaria, also known as the West Bank, and then to annex all of these so-called territories. Now, the Trump administration has yet to take a position on this issue. However, I'd like to remind everyone that the God of Israel has already made his position known, and he's not for a two-state solution. So in that vein of thought, one Israeli official said recently that the only way to remove the threat a Palestinian state would pose to Israel is to apply Israeli sovereignty over the entire settlements in Judea and Samaria. There are even some reports that say the Israeli government now considers security in the West Bank to be an official war goal. Now, of course, a one-state position flies in the face of world opinion, and should this occur, that is the one-state solution, many stations will huff and puff and they'll want to punish Israel for going against their collective will. But again, the God of Israel has something to say on the matter, and he has declared this: because you have said, these two nations and these two countries shall be mine, and we will possess them. And he's speaking to those who claim that the land is theirs and not Israel. The Lord said, I will do according to your anger and according to the envy which you showed in your hatred against them. And I will make myself known among them when I judge you. In other words, God will make himself known to his people when he judges their enemies. Now, in regard to disputed lands, the God of Israel has said, my people Israel shall take possession of you, and you shall be their inheritance. The world may have its plans where the land of Israel is concerned, but the Lord has a plan that cannot be altered, and it will not be delayed past the appointed time that he has ordained. And so all of this that's going on makes me wonder whether the events that have transpired since October 7, including the events of October 7, have changed the trajectory in regard to this two-state solution that's being pushed all these many years and all the things that are going on in the Middle East. I have to wonder if a greater number of Israelis have come to realize that, you know what, their enemies aren't as all-powerful as they made themselves to be. It is as... You're going to have to do something there. As it was said to those who first entered the land under Joshua's leadership, be strong and of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, he is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Perhaps many Israelis have come to realize that you really can't make peace with terrorists, and there is no such thing as peaceful coexistence with those who don't recognize the sovereignty of Israel's God. And this, in part, is why I believe God told the Israelis of long ago that when it comes to the people that are living in the land, you shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them, nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughter to their son, nor take their daughter for your son, for they will turn your sons away from following me. Now, I realize what I just read, what the Lord said, would be considered by many as offensive and certainly politically incorrect. Still, it is biblically correct. And I'm beginning to think that we're on the verge of a lot of people getting highly offended because God is getting ready to correct a lot of things in this world. Now, I know that no one can be absolutely certain of what tomorrow will bring, but I can't help but think that wrongs are being righted. God has sworn that he will not allow what Isaiah calls the covenant of death to stand. He said that it will be annulled. And I believe that for years now, the people of Israel and many around the world, including some believers, have accepted the idea that it is the only way to go is to live alongside people and groups who are in essence a death cult. People who celebrate death, and especially the death of those they despise, and in this case, Israel. But again, God said that this will not stand. To agree to such, he says, would be to invite what he called an overflowing scourge and to allow it to pass through the land. And then he added that it will be a terror just to understand the report. And I find that very interesting in light of what happened on October 7th. So is it possible then that God allowed October 7th to occur that he might annul the covenant with death that so many seem to be content to make? So in light of a two-state solution, here is what the sovereign Lord has declared. On that day, I will raise up the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down, and repair its damages. I will raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord who does this thing. In other words, what that prophecy is saying is that there will be one nation, not two. There will be one people who will be united under one king, that is the Messiah. As it's written, the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day it shall be, the Lord is one, and his name one. Ladies and gentlemen, in the end, there will be one nation under God. And no, I'm not referring to the United States, because you see, the real golden age is coming. But it's when the Messiah, Yeshua, sits upon his throne and rules the nations from Jerusalem with a rod of iron. In that day when he makes his enemies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and all who stand against his purposes, when he makes them his footstool. I believe that we are on the cusp of incredibly exciting, perhaps sometimes a little bit frightening, nonetheless prophetic events. And you and I have been placed in the kingdom to watch this, to observe this, but not sit on the sidelines, but to be part of this. We've come into the kingdom for such as this. And so we look ahead to the day when there is one nation, one kingdom, one king, and one people.
Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to get the latest updates from Bill, and check out other podcasts available from Jacob's Tent. And join us next week on The Weekly Scroll.